startups begin in communities across the country.
Why does Silicon Valley get so much credit? My name is Nick Kastner.
And I'm Caitlin Clays. We're interviewing the people building startup communities across America.
But in the areas no one is talking about, the middle.
This is the Ecosystem Builder Podcast by mug.news.
Welcome to this episode of the Ecosystem Builder Podcast. This is the probably last piece of content for the time being where Caitlin and I are in the same room, and it is the first time Caitlin and I are co-interviewing someone. So we have an ongoing joke that there's a studio audience here, so the studio audience is roaring right now on their feet. But today's Ecosystem Builder is Tom Chapman. Tom is an entrepreneur, ecosystem builder from Omaha, and now advises ecosystem builders across the country. Tom, thank you for joining.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, we're both excited to have you.
Yeah, and just to say, we do know Tom. Okay, he's been like the organizer of mug.news. But a conversation piece before we started the episode was Tom asked, it's like, so do I pretend like I know you guys? Like, do we know each other? And it's like, yes, we can. We'll make that clear.
Caitlin came over to my house and had dinner with my 6 kids, 5 of my 6 kids last night. So it would be disingenuous for me to be like, it's really nice to meet you.
Yeah. Oh, you have purple hair. Interesting. I've never seen it.
Yeah, that is hilarious. So Tom, I'm excited. So we've worked together. We started the show about a year ago, and we've worked together since then. And a lot of these questions I'm excited to ask you because we've never really like gone into your background or professional experience. So to have this like sort of more formal way to do that, I'm excited for this conversation. So to start with, Tom, and I know some of this, and I'm sure Caitlin does too. How did you get into ecosystem building?
It's a great question. I think like most ecosystem builders, I more stumbled into it. So I came back to Omaha in 2003 and started law school. And I was looking around saying, I really don't want to go to law school. I don't want to be a lawyer, but I kind of like the idea of getting an advanced degree, and it gives me some time. I had worked at Enron and had some jobs that were pretty tough, but like what I didn't exist here, but my wife and I are both from the area, so we moved back. So in that time, I identified the Omaha Chamber, and I was like, hey, I kind of think they know what's going on. And so I went and talked to some of my friends, some people I didn't know, and just said, hey, what are you guys worried about? And they said, hey, we really want to attract insurance companies because we think there's an opportunity to do this. So I started working for the Omaha Chamber in 2004, I'm going to say. If that's incorrect, I'm not trying to mislead. I just don't remember the dates. I'm pretty old. You guys make fun of me. Caitlin was making fun of me last night that she thought I had gray hair. She said, you have brown hair. Because I always have a hat on, and so it looks like gray. Anyway.
I was 9 years old in 2004, just to put it in context. So.
I was older than 9. So within that, we started this conversation with the chamber, and they were like, hey, help us do this. And as I started driving around and talking to people, what really was coming to the forefront was that economic development was a little bit misaligned, that a lot of the leaders in the community were like, what we really care about is wealth, not necessarily any job. We want good jobs. And I thought that at the time, today it's easier to look back and be like, And so I just started thinking about it and like truly took 2 years of like doing my job, but at night or when I'm driving to Lincoln to go to law school, going like, there's something just not quite right. And as I dug into it, I realized that the key behind a lot of what people were talking about was this need to really reinforce and grow entrepreneurship. So ecosystem building is really a term that got coined almost 5 years after I started ecosystem building. I don't want to say I was one of the first, because I think there's people that have done this, but in the new generation of ecosystem builders, I was one of the first people that really said, hey, here's the thing. We can't just sort of write small business plans and think that's what's needed. What we have to do is really think about a system that these entrepreneurs are demanding. So first, you got to start with the entrepreneur in the middle, right? And so as soon as you start asking them, hey, what do you need? It comes back to like, God, I'm really having a hard time finding, a co-founder or talent, or I really need customers. And so that really sort of opened my eyes to the idea that we're not building systems on the problems that entrepreneurs have. We're typically building systems that require like, we're going to build a building because that's what entrepreneurs need. Or we're going to build, programming around how to use QuickBooks because that's what they need. And those are not unimportant, but they're an element, not the system. And so that system approach, I would say, is probably the thing that both attracted me and scares the crap out of me, because it's like there's 70 things moving at any given time in an ecosystem. And a lot of times, I'll go in and talk to somebody, they'll be like, yeah, but just tell us the one thing to do. And it's like, it's a great question. Don't have a one thing. I mean, there's certain things I believe, but I wouldn't say there's one panacea.
What is your response when someone's like, all right, what's the one thing?
I usually say, number one, find your entrepreneurs. So I find that a lot of organizations around the country are like, we're an ecosystem builder. But if you say, okay, name 5 entrepreneurs from your community and tell me what they need, people struggle to do that. So we are in Omaha, Nebraska right now, but I think Eastern Nebraska is really indicative. If you walk around Eastern Nebraska and you say, tell me about entrepreneurship, people will be like, oh, there's this great company. It's called Huddle. And it's like, Huddle is like a $500 million company. Like, they're not a startup.
And now 12 years old.
And 12 years, probably older than that. I think I worked with them in about 2006 when they had 1 customer. And the point of that is to say, a lot of times by the time there's a cool, quote, startup, they're actually not a startup anymore. They're past even the scale-up stage, because a lot of times they're not in the Omaha World Herald or your local publication. So the second thing I say is typically if you find your entrepreneurs and then tell their stories, you'll notice that immediately there's a bunch of things that come back to you that are like, hey, we need capital. Hey, we're struggling to find first customers. Hey, there's this little cluster of stuff over here, but we could really use some reinforcement from research. Hey, and that should drive whatever a community is thinking about, rather than the other way around, where the community is like, we're going to be the leaders in space technology. What advantage do you have? Absolutely none. And a lot of communities start there, and I think that's completely backwards. And to give you an idea, we're in the Midwest. How many Midwest communities say we're the leader, or we're going to be the leader in ag tech? And ag tech is an enormous space. Most communities can say, actually, what we're really good at is this one thing. So, in Nebraska, for example, we're very good at center pivot irrigation and the idea of groundwater irrigation, sensors, things of this nature. We're also really good at livestock. Those are 2 things. That doesn't necessarily mean we're good at autonomous farming. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to make equipment. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be good at stuff that other parts of the region are good at. Understanding where your comparative advantage is requires you to spend a little bit more time being honest with yourself, looking in the mirror and saying, we're actually good at this, not that. And the not that part, just saying we're not going to do that, is probably as important as deciding what you are going to do.
So Caitlin and I, on the past few episodes, have, referred to the humility in the Midwest kind of getting in the way of looking in the mirror and deciding what you're not good at. Do you have any advice on approaching that for ecosystem builders?
It's a great question. One of the hard things that I've discovered over time is you have to pull the Band-Aid off at some point. And what I found, and they call it the Nebraska maybe, where people are like, when in their head they're saying, absolutely not, 0%, no way. And sometimes the humility to just stand up and say, hey, we've been talking about this thing for 15 years and nothing's happened. Why hasn't it happened? Is really important. And once you do that, it frees everyone else up in the room to say the same thing. It doesn't mean that you're countercultural. It doesn't mean that you're against whatever's happening, but sometimes there's just stuff going on. So I'll use the example of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm a 45-year-old white dude, so I should probably never talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but just bear with me. We have, as a country, I think, woken up because we ripped that incredibly painful Band-Aid off over and over and over. And now pretty much every community is like, oh, we need a plan. That's different than doing something. Communities have to do stuff. They can't just say, we believe in diversity. We believe in equity. It's, okay, what are you doing about it? And I think most communities struggle to walk the walk. I think it's a parallel track with regards to entrepreneurs. There are very few people that are like, entrepreneurs, we're against entrepreneurship. We are only for big businesses. Most people are like, we admire people that pull themselves up by the bootstraps or do that. But then when you say, what are you doing? They'll be like, oh, we have all sorts of programs. And it's like, yeah, but what are you doing? And people have a hard time articulating their own actions to help people who are starting businesses. And I think a lot of times those actions are not hard, but they require people to really call account. You got to do stuff based on what you're good at. So if you work in a big company, you should be a customer. Starting a new corporate innovation program is not bad. But like that is not the same thing as helping a startup find money via customers by helping a startup build a good product because you're a user. And I think a lot of times it's easy to sort of be like, oh, we're supportive of this thing, but we're not committed to it. I think to be supportive, you got to commit.
I've definitely been in the room where you've had your call to action moment. Like that is very much, you're saying, I've seen you say what's on everyone's mind. And from being in that room, that's really when the ball starts moving. So I can just say, like, I've been in the room with that conversation. And so it's been very like interesting to be a part of that. I know, for example, my Midwest personality has definitely been like, okay, like be polite. And then, but it's also like, if you want change to happen, you have to be vocal about it. And so that's definitely something I seriously have learned from you too.
Yeah. I guess big point you just made that I really want to go back to is the actually doing something that is supportive and not, I think I was at one of my favorite bands. I was at their concert and I like their stuff on Facebook. So that's supporting, but I also bought a t-shirt because that like money is way better than liking their stuff on Facebook. And there's a lot of like, oh, we'll comment on your Facebook post, but not the actual, like, we'll be a customer.
So I teach entrepreneurship at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And one of the things that I have to convince to my students as an entrepreneur, like somebody that actually sells stuff to real customers, is having somebody like, oh, this is cool, is not the same thing as somebody saying, this is cool and here's $100. The $100 is what you care about, because this is cool might be like, this is cool, but I could never use it because it's the wrong color. This is cool, but like it's too confusing. This is like the feedback from getting money articulates that commitment in a way that it doesn't. So again, we do a lot of interviews in my consulting practice with startups and helping startups then interview potential customers. And one of the questions that they rarely want to ask is, what would you pay for this? And there's about 15 different ways you can kind of slide it in. What would you pay for this? We've been talking to people like you, and they're thinking that the price point for this is between $200 and $400. Does that seem like something you would pay for it? And there's a lot of different ways to sort of get to that question. But if you don't ask about price, if you don't, it's sort of like you are required, if you're doing this right, to not just take the Nebraska maybe, but to get to the point where you're actually getting people to articulate their commitment, not just say, yeah, generally I'm, for good and against evil. That's me.
Yeah. So as someone who started this field, even arguably, of ecosystem builders,
I wouldn't say that, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, you were definitely on the forefront of establishing it as a practice. Have you seen America's perspective on entrepreneurship change, or have you, because you're also a huge data guy, have you seen any of the data improve since then? And not even like the actual metrics, looking like the amount of new businesses start changing the question slightly. What metrics should we be evaluating America's success as entrepreneurship on?
Really good question. All right, I'm going to change the question a little bit to start, and then I'll come back to it.
Okay.
So I'm fat. Okay. I was fatter.
Okay.
At what point do you go, I'm fat? Do you do it when you're 1 pound heavier than you want to, or 20 pounds heavier than you want to? It's usually 20 pounds. Like, there's not a bright line until there's a bright line, right? You go to a point where you're like, I'm way past where I should be. For the last 20 years, those in the space have been raising their hands going, hey. Like, we aren't starting enough businesses. Not just we're not starting enough venture-backed businesses or Main Street, like businesses, period. So the Kauffman Foundation has put out data after data after data. Victor Huang has run around going, oh my gosh, this is our startup rate. This is where it has been historically. There's tons of data that says we're way behind in terms of the starts we have. Okay. So I don't know that you need to say like, well, this is the best metric, to say there's 15 different metrics that are all saying kind of the same thing, that we haven't had startups. But again, when you start looking at what that bright line looks like, COVID is a really good indicator of suddenly people are like, oh, you know what we might want? Small businesses might be important. And like, they definitely don't have the cash to survive if they're not getting paid for 6 months. Boom, PPP loan. Look at how many companies got PPP loans, and look at where they were, and look at what kind of businesses they were. And like, it sort of provides a bright light on integration with like community banks. Those places that have a lot of community banks were able to get PPP loans at a higher rate. That's a really good signal. Like, going back and just looking at the health of the PPP loans and the speed at which they went, to look at individual ecosystems and say, how did we do? It's not perfect, but it's like a fine way to kind of just instantly look. One of the pieces of data that we look at is we look at SBA loans, community bank loans in zip codes that are poor, to say, okay, what's going on in this community between the rich and the poor? If you go to like the suburban communities that are relatively wealthy in any metro area, they have tons of SBA loans. So on a per capita basis, really high. If you go into the areas that are the poorest, often the most African American, those SBA loans are really low. And like when I go around, people are like, yeah, but that's because nobody applies for an SBA loan. Yeah, but if you go back 30 years and you look at that same segment of the population, there were far more SBA loans that were getting loaned by local banks that had local presences, that had relationships with the people on the ground. It's not that the SBA loan is if we did a better job at SBA loans, it's a signal to a growing trend of we don't have these relationships in key parts, key neighborhoods, key areas that are degrading sort of our urban areas. So again, it's not the metric. It's looking at the metric as a signal for other underlying systemic problems. So if you said, what are some of those systemic problems in the United States? We spend billions of dollars in research and development. Little of that ever gets transferred into technology. I can give you university-based data. I can say, here's the autumn data. Here's what the NSF says. Again, the metric's unimportant because the data is consistent. Because there's nobody who really understands it or has sort of this worldview looking at that data, we never talk about it. We never say, okay, way back in 1980, we passed this thing called Bayh-Dole, and there was a real improvement in technology transfer, and now we're not doing as well. When I talk about that on stage, people instantly think I'm calling to account wherever I am that university. I'm not. Every university is behind. There are some real exceptions, like the University of Utah has done an outstanding job. But doing an outstanding job is like you're creating a relative value against somebody who's not doing a good job. Saying, see, we kicked their butts. And it's like, yeah. So I go back to like the education system. And I say, if our goal is to lead the world in innovation, we should be really good at math. Are we? No. I go back and look at immigration. And I say, okay, if you look at the last 50 years, since 1976, how many billion-dollar enterprises were started and how many of them had an immigrant founder? The answer is about 57%. Are those people still coming to the United States? Maybe. Those are the sorts of things that I say, if you're thinking at the big system level, there's a lot of these indicators that you can find that's like a one-off, but then it cascades into 15 different other things. Because those immigrants were also people transferring technology as grad assistants at Stanford, MIT, et cetera, who were also people that excelled at math, which meant the average ACT score. Like, go down the list and it's like, well, which metric do you choose to say, here's the problem? All of them are relatively consistent, but none of them are necessarily the canary in the coal mine that's laying dead in the corner.
Yeah. Interesting.
So I have a question then. So relating to this financing, this question, I won't take credit for it. Scott Bragg from The Office is also had sent it in, but he had mentioned that you've been a VC in the past at Nebraska Global. And so his question was, when is venture capital good and when is it bad? Do you have thoughts on that?
I have many thoughts on that and also. Let's talk about venture capital and what it is. Venture capital is a class of risk capital. So if you say risk capital, i.e. I'm buying equity, when is the right time for that? So I'm going to exclude private equity. I'm going to exclude like, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to sell a chunk of the business and have a liquidation experience. We're going to say something in the early stage. So it might be from friends and family. It might be angels. It might be some other function. So I'm not going to define venture, but generally I look at it as like an institutional round above $2 million. So I'm going to say inclusive of that, but also including the earlier stuff. In general, when you're thinking about that risk capital, I try to say, okay, what are you going to do with it? There are certain businesses that are really inclined towards risk capital needs. So I'm going to use software as an example. Basically, you go out, you interview, you spend some money, you build software. So as you're building software, you're hiring relatively expensive people who are building software, which means you need something to pay for that. You can bootstrap it if you're really wealthy. It's really hard if I'm making a U shape. If your loss is significant, to be able to just say, oh, I'm just going to eat this loss. And so you go out and you say, I'm going to find some other people that also agree that this is a useful software, et cetera, and raise risk capital. And again, it might be friends, families, it might be angels, it might be all sorts of folks. So there's some types of businesses that are going to go into the hole before they come out. Software, again, is a good example because there's really big margins after you start selling it. Okay. So when you look at software, you kind of go, okay, it's kind of perfectly built for something like risk capital to come in at the beginning, like venture capital, which is why a lot of the venture capital around the world looks like that. Same thing is true in energy, right? It's so capital intensive that it's hard to line up $20 million to build a prototype by just being like, it's just a second, it's in the back room. There are just so few players that have that capital has organized itself to be able to go do that. All right. So in general, I want to make sure I have those definitions in place. So if you're an entrepreneur and you're sitting there saying, I need capital. And by the way, when I talk to entrepreneurs, it comes up in almost every conversation. About 75% of the time, a person says, the reason that I'm not succeeding is capital. A lot of times if you say, well, what would you use the capital for? Sometimes it's like, well, I don't know what to do. Like that's the genesis. Like I'm not sure. And so it buys me a year of time. Not a good time to raise risk capital. You're going to have a hard time doing it. It's going to steal your time, et cetera, et cetera. What you want to have done as the entrepreneur is de-risk whatever you're doing to the point where the capital is going to be used in a systemic way to grow the business, specifically the revenue, or if you're in bioscience, to get the science over a clear milestone. So you might say, $1 million gets me over, that bridge right there. And you say, hey, if I get over that bridge, now the whole country is my ocean. And so, but $1 million is a lot of money. Here's why we think we can get over the bridge, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a good idea to go as a VC to be like, we're looking for bridges for you to cross. And that looks like one, let's give you money. Instead, you want somebody who comes in with a relatively clear plan about how they're going to use the capital. And that plan leads very clearly to some sort of next articulation. Revenue's coming in the door, you have traction, et cetera. So most risk capital is deployed into something where the growth in revenue is relatively transparent to the capital usage. It doesn't necessarily mean that I give you 500,000 and you make $1 million. It might be I give you 500,000 and you make 200, but that 200 is repeatable. So if we give you $1 million, you're going to make 2 million. And if we give you 10 million, you're going to make 50 million. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was that helpful? That might've just been like,
no, I feel like I'm getting an MBA right now.
Yeah, seriously. It's like, okay, I can get a credit for this, right? Like a college credit.
Yeah. LinkedIn certified, baby.
Yeah.
That was a really good question. Scott sent us a list of questions. Some of them were pretty like Scott Bragg inspired that I was like, I don't know if we need to take off.
Yeah.
I'll pose that one to you. He had one about working at Enron. I don't know if
I'm happy to talk about Enron.
You are? Okay. Well, I'm going to say the question then, since Scott said...
He said, why didn't I go to jail?
Yeah,
exactly.
That's exactly...
Yeah.
I mean, you said it, Tom. You said it, not me.
Yeah. So, number one, I did nothing wrong.
But that's what they all said.
But no. So let me walk through my Enron experience, because that way it lays the foundation for, I think, having a conversation about it.
Yeah.
So I started at Enron about a year out of college. I was an English major. So the idea that I went in and worked in this essentially big investment bank makes me laugh. But I did. So I started in government affairs. And essentially in government affairs, my job was to do risk analysis on international assets and to identify like policy change in North Carolina. Well, everybody quit around me. So it might be I smelled bad. It might be, I can tell you what each individual person said, but the long and short of it is they had a better opportunity. They got a negative performance review. And so I just ended up, they're like, we need you to go to North Carolina today and go in front of a committee and talk about energy deregulation. So I was 24. I was like, okay. So I must not have been terrible, or they didn't watch, probably the latter. No. And so nobody really wanted to go to a lot of the places I was willing to go. So for the first year and a half, 2 years I worked at Enron, I started lobbying in different states. So I lobbied in total somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 states, mostly in the U.S. Southeast. But like Pennsylvania was an example, Virginia, Maryland, where I would be in front of their Public Utilities Commission, et cetera. As part of that effort, a lot of what I was arguing towards was energy deregulation. So the idea that retail deregulation should occur. So if you're familiar with the Texas blackouts from last winter, that would have come about in 2000, SB 7. I did not work in Texas, but it was something that I was aware of. We were making an argument for that, and we can have a conversation about energy deregulation later if you want, but I'm not going to go there because people will be like, what are we listening to?
Very outside of the entrepreneurship topic.
But I learned how to build 4 different types of wholesale electricity markets. Because of that expertise, the trading desk at Enron asked me to come down and do pricing on a bunch of new instruments that were called FTRs, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was down on the trading desk when everything kind of went to pot. So Enron was a big commodities trader. We ran a program called Enron Online. Enron Online at the time was touching for every electron traded, for every 7 electrons traded, it was touching 6 of them. So we were getting part of that spread. So after the bankruptcy, my job was to value the whole book because we had sold everyone. So in North America, our absolute value was, I don't know, $10 to $20 billion, somewhere in that general range of transactions. And my job was to do a daily rundown of here's how much this thing's worth. And it was just me for about 4 months. And then we added some people that I trained up, et cetera. So I had 2 really different jobs at Enron. I lobbied for them, and then I worked on the trading desk. So within that, I saw a lot of Enron, the world, and people often say, like, what do you think happened? And like, the truth is, I have no idea. Like, the finance department was an incredibly small sliver of Enron. So the only thing I ever did with the finance department was when I was on the trading desk, I would call them because part of the portfolio was in Canada and get the exchange rate between Canadian and US dollars so that I could price it right. Mm-hmm. So I mean, like, literally I had no interaction. I did, when I was doing government affairs, I was the lead government person on $1 billion transactions. I mean, so I was in the room for big transactions. They were not involved. So long story short, it's a small group. That doesn't mean that it was a small effort. It's obviously a huge effort. There's tons of books written that you can go through and look at special purpose entities and all this sort of stuff. But I never saw any of it. So it is what it is.
I think it's interesting to kind of tie it back to ecosystem building that you lobbied state officials. Was that exclusively, it was just state? Like, the state government is the extent of your lobbying effort with Enron?
That was me sighing. I'm trying to remember. I know that I had to go to FERC. I think I was just looking. I think I was just watching stuff. I don't think I ever was on a committee or gave any stuff. But yeah, for the most part, after the bankruptcy, I did definitely have calls from people that wanted curves from various organizations, FERC, SEC, et cetera. Yeah. But if you even said who was it, I'd be like, I don't know.
Yeah. So as far as entrepreneurial policy, would you think state, federal, or local policy is more impactful to entrepreneurial ecosystems? Like, because they all would play into local ecosystems, but is one more important than the other?
It probably depends a little bit on, so again, I would say, all right, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm putting on my entrepreneur hat. My wife runs a small business. I would say local policy probably affects her business more, but state and federal regulation she's an eye doctor, affect her regulatory structure more than local. So, taxes are a thing, but I don't think anybody's like, well, I'm not doing this because they raised taxes 2%, which is a pretty consistent theme that I hear from politicians at both federal and state level. I think it's much more about regulatory effects on how that affects individual businesses. Now, if you said, all right, I pick a lane and I'm one of those 3 spaces, where can I have the biggest impact? I think probably the state level. Okay. I think at the federal level, there's too many moving parts in individual states, too much bureaucracy to really effectuate change. So I would say the state level. So I know that's not exactly what you asked, but I think to have the biggest effect is state.
Okay. And what would be policy changes at a state level that would be the biggest impact?
So it really comes down to what we were talking about earlier about comparative advantage, right? So individual states have different things that they're good at, right? So if you said, what is a policy change in North Dakota versus California? It's probably not the same thing, right? So I'm going to talk towards areas that I've spent some time and know a little bit more about.
Okay. Or even Nebraska, because you've
been, So Nebraska in 2011 enacted a bill called the Business Innovation Act, where they started 4 or 5 programs. So economic gardening, which I testified towards, has not been very effective, but I think it is effective when implemented in other places. So like Littleton, Colorado has done an amazing job with economic gardening. And they're
like gardening, what's economic gardening?
Economic gardening is the idea of you identify phase 2 businesses. So businesses that have between $1 and $20 million that have the ability to potentially export a good, and you help them figure out export markets for that good, growing them from $5 million to $50 million. So the goal of most economic development is to create entrepreneurial exports, i.e. I make widgets of some variety, I send them somewhere else, and we bring cash in. That's how you create wealth in a community. That's different than what you might do to incent my wife's eye doctor practice. There are very few people that travel more than 45 minutes to go see the eye doctor. Not none, but like relatively small group, right? So you're probably not going to go around and be like, well, we're going to enact great state policy to create more eye doctors. That being said, Oklahoma has used it, and it's been very effective because they've done stuff with regards to surgical practices by optometrists. It's led a lot of optometrists to open offices in Oklahoma and all over the place. They open an optometry school there. So the point of that is I don't know that there's one formula, right? So people are like, well, California clearly doesn't have their act together. And yet you go, Silicon Valley's in California. And then they're like, well, California clearly has their act together. And you're like, well, Austin's in Texas. And literally, if you take state policy, they're almost diametrically opposed in terms of the way they do things. So I don't think there's one formula. But back to Nebraska, I think the prototype grant program at the Department of Economic Development, which basically provides a 1-to-2 or 1-to-4 match if you're in value-added ag, has been exceptionally effective at help finding venture-based businesses and getting them going to the point where they have enough traction to say, like, this is a thing, or it's not a thing. And I think that more states like Nebraska should try to figure out how to get more at-bats at higher growth exporting businesses. That's an example of a program that does that. Kentucky uses a phase 0 program around SBIR that's really effective. Nebraska modeled it, not as effective. Why? No idea. So there's some of those sorts of things that I would say around the country, my job is to say, do you know about this? Not, this is the best thing for you. There's certain things that we found that are pretty consistently like, if you get a little bit more grant money in the right people's hands, generally that leads to better outcomes.
What local ecosystems do you think are doing an exceptional job around the Midwest or even across the country?
So I'm going to break it into 3 buckets because I think cities are really different. You know, cities that are moderately small, I'm going to use, let's talk about Lincoln because I think Lincoln does really well. I don't know that that's a small city for a lot of people. It's a college town. It's the home of state government. But Lincoln has done an exceptional job, and I think Christina Oldfather does a great job. I think you guys interviewed Christina.
Yes, yeah.
At help galvanizing sort of what's going on. But really key corporate player Nelnet has been very active at pushing money into deals. Huddle was created 15, 18 years ago. And within that creates a like, oh, there's our heroes and we want to go do that. So that led to the next generation of sports tech like Elite Form, Open Doors, Acuvera, et cetera. So that path I think is really indicative. I think there are other communities that have used a different path. So Madison would be an example, really doing well. Madison started, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Fund at one point was kicking out technologies. They were doing really well. I'm not sure that's still true looking at the data, but at one point they were doing that. In addition, you had Epic, which is north of Madison, but kind of in the MSA, that helped generate sort of this healthcare IT expertise. You had the University of Wisconsin pushing stuff out, but I think it was really the Capital Entrepreneurs Program in the mid-2000s where you had 20 or 30 mentor-type relationships kick off that really started moving a bunch of these companies like PurBlue, et cetera, forward. And some of that was capital and some of that was mentoring, but a lot of it was just like, we're in it together and we're going to help each other. That, I think, at its core kind of speaks to ecosystem building because it wasn't one thing. Those capital entrepreneurs were doing a bunch of things. Now, if you said other communities, I mean, I could sit here and rattle off, well, this community is doing this well and da-da-da-da. I'm going to call out a couple communities that I think get called out for the wrong stuff. So I'm going to talk about Research Triangle Park. Research Triangle Park is Durham, Raleigh, North Carolina, kind of the triangle in there.
Okay.
I think it's Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill is the triangle, but it might be Winston-Salem. It's not super important to the story other than I've seen now multiple universities say, well, we're just going to do what they do. What they don't recognize, they start in 1980 rather than 1940. So for 20 years, RTP had nothing. And then they had one thing and it was okay. And it was a slow roll, but they had patience is what they had. A lot of communities are like, well, we need a result in 1 year. And there just isn't a strategy for systemic change in 1 year. It just doesn't really exist. And so part of what communities need to do, regardless of the strategy they take, is have the patience to see it through. And I think most communities don't have that patience. Some of it is political, i.e. the policy changes because you have different mayors or different governors or whatever. But I think a lot of it is that if you look at entrepreneurs, they're not out there tooting their own horn. They're just going to work every day trying to get something done. And if you don't have that focus on like, how do we just keep feeding that beast, you just end up kind of either starving them or they move away. And again, I can tell you a bunch of stories, but I'm not gonna. Instead, I'm gonna just say that patience is something we see. The second thing that I would say is I think Chicago is a really good example of a city that was not doing particularly well at entrepreneurship in the mid-2000s. So if you look at venture capital dollars, et cetera, they're kicking butt right now. And they're kicking butt because for a long time, they've just done one thing right, another thing right, another thing right. So if you look at the Pritzker family and you look at all the venture capital companies that they've put a little bit of money into to spur that investment community, there's now, I don't know, hundreds, tens of venture companies in Chicago that weren't there 15 years ago. If you look at like the different areas where they're like, yeah, we're going to work with Techstars and we're going to have 1871 and we're going to do this at the state level and it was just a little bit at a time saying, all right, we're just going to do a little bit more. And some of that's capital, but a lot of it was, and again, I want to stress this, it's one or two people making a decision together or alone to do a better job of supporting an entrepreneur or a fleet of entrepreneurs. And you get one person that does it with 4 or 5, and then they do 4 or 5 the next year, and then 4 or 5, and then there's 2 people, and like it has a cascading effect, a flywheel effect, if you will, that ultimately leads to people going like, well, what was the systemic change? And it was the change of a couple people to start, and then continuing to feed that change rather than being like, nope, stop, we're going to do something totally different. I think a lot of communities have basically gone through and been like, well, we tried that for 18 months and it didn't work. And it's like, no joke. 18 months is not a long enough time.
Yeah. So I have one more question, Caitlin. Feel free to like jump in or tag some on.
If you wanted to ask your question.
Yeah. Is there anything within the ecosystem industry that you think the industry or like the thought leaders are looking at it wrong, or the perspective needs to be shifted on it?
I worry that a lot of times when I talk to people, they're not thinking about the entrepreneur. That they're just not internalizing the struggle of being an entrepreneur. I think Rick Tarazi is a really good example of somebody that puts startups first, like really understands Rick is in Portland, Oregon, really understands the like plight of the entrepreneur. And just, it's really hard as somebody who started businesses, it's really hard. The emotional strain of being an entrepreneur is really hard. And I think when you come with empathy and you just kind of start with the idea that like, this is a super hard thing, it gets easier to listen to somebody maybe be an asshole, because there are times when entrepreneurs are assholes. It gets easier to listen to somebody who isn't making much sense about what they need because they may not know. You know what I mean? When you just start with like, it's not the same thing as going to a job and being like, well, if you sell this thing right here for this price, we're going to give you a bonus. As opposed to being like, I don't know what I'm selling. I don't know where the right here is. And I don't know who my customer is. Like that's almost infuriating. And like the wins are rarely public. Like figuring something out isn't something that's like, oh, honey, great job figuring out that your beachhead market might include dance teams. Like it just isn't a thing. Like there's not a conversation that most people can relate to. Mm-hmm. And so as ecosystem builders, I think being in that place with the entrepreneur is probably the thing that I worry about, because people are sort of too into program building. Mm-hmm. And it's like, sometimes it's okay if you're like, dude, what's up? Like, let's just stop for a minute and talk.
So a question I have then is kind of introspectively thinking, more looking at Omaha specifically. What's one thing that entrepreneurs or just anyone in general wouldn't know about the Omaha ecosystem?
So a couple things that I pull out that I think there's a lack, just a mistake that people from the outside looking into Omaha. Mm-hmm. As Omaha has had success, I feel like there's a lot of reference to like, oh, Warren Buffett has been particularly participatory. And it's like, not at all, 0%. Like, not that Warren Buffett has done nothing. I mean, he's created incredible wealth from here. Berkshire Hathaway is incredibly successful, et cetera. But like that way of investing, that way of thinking about the world does not overlap into a lot of the success that entrepreneurs have had over the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. So that's one. Second thing is, I do think, I have 3 or 4 things that I'm like, I wish I could really figure this out. I do think that like having a vibrant, like creative scene is really important. And so, before this podcast, we were talking about where should we go to watch cool bands. And we were talking about the waiting room, we were talking about Slowdown. Mm-hmm. Like if you look back to the early 2000s, there were a lot of great bands that were like rising. I think there's something about the confidence that like bands or artists have as they're going through that also inspire people to kind of just go out there even when they don't know what they're doing and lead with their face. And so I think there's something there. So I kind of go back to the Cog Factory in the early 90s, the mid 90s, which was this place where kids could basically show up and just play. Mm-hmm. And I look at that and I say the Cog Factory, I think really does have a lot to do with the art scene in Omaha and in turn the entrepreneurship scene. And so it's like a nothing event, but I like still would say that's something most people don't think about. I think the other thing people kind of just mistake, this is less about Omaha, more just about entrepreneurship, is like the cascading effect of one really good team and like just can have a huge long-term effect. So again, people would say, well, where did the startups in Omaha come from? And I think there's a lot of answers. I think very few people. So Bill Fisher, who I'm going to reference here, would say, well, it came from this consulting practice at IBM. I would say it came out of Bill's work at ACI looking at the map, but like it doesn't matter because Bill's sort of at the head along with Ray Krogan, and all the stuff that came out of financial systems came out of kind of this cadre of stuff in the 1980s, whether it's D3 banking or it's FTNI or, you know, Secure Sky, you know, go down the list of all this stuff that kind of bears out on it. And they all have kind of a similar genealogical tree. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people don't necessarily know where that tree came from, but I think it's really important to recognize it's not from the usual suspects. So it's not from your Fortune 500 companies. And I think around the country, that's not always true, but it's often true. And I think it's one of the big mistakes people start where they're like, oh, well, we clearly need Mutual of Omaha or Berkshire Hathaway to drive this train. And it's like, maybe not. Like, it's great if they participate. And I think Mutual has been particularly participatory the last 2 or 3 years. But like a lot of times it's not who you think it is. And those signals are often like a lot of churn, a lot of radical changes fast, and they fire a lot of people, right? So they fire people because they're like, well, that's not quite a business in our business, but it might be a business. Why don't you go try it somewhere else? And there's a whole system of people who put capital into it, who care about it, who are experts, who could be talent. Like all of those elements end up overlapping into like successful genealogical trees. But I think sometimes it's hard to identify this thing's happening because there's a perspective that the best startup should produce that or this but it's not. I mean, it could be, but it's not. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, totally. So then looking at the entrepreneur and from their perspective, what is some advice that you would give an entrepreneur who's just starting their business?
Know your customer backwards and forwards. Understand your intervention point. So why are they buying what you're selling? When do they buy it? Why do they use it? All those sort of like really understand your customer.
That was rapid fire right away.
Yeah. Well, it's, you know, I've done this a bunch. And I would say the companies that we've struggled with have often been, we can't quite nail the value prop and who the customer is. Mm-hmm. Conversely, the ones that just accelerate like crazy are like, oh, this is what they care about.
So yeah, I guess the other question I have is that, so kind of going back to finances a little bit, and with Omaha, Nebraska, are there any, interest-free loans, grants that people can check out in this area when they're starting up?
So we talked a little bit about the prototype grant program. It's not free, but it's available. Launch Lincoln has their grant program, which is $25,000 application. You kind of go through a little screening, but that is a free grant. Both of those are the prototype program statewide. Lincoln has the Launch Lincoln grants. You know, there's programs like the Nebraska Enterprise Fund for people who are unbankable. Like that program itself, yeah, there's interest rates, et cetera, but it is sort of like a lead-in to being bankable. So if you have a business that you are thinking may be eligible, but you go to a bank and they're not particularly attentive, that's a good one. As you start looking at like micro-lending, there's a bunch of different micro-lending programs here, including the SBA micro-lending program that's run out of, I forget what the organization is out of South Omaha. So, I mean, there are programs that exist in the space where I would say a lot of people here would say, oh, we don't have capital. I think there's 3 kind of issues with we don't have capital. One is, I think truly if you're trying to start a Main Street business and you're in an underrepresented population or in a neighborhood that isn't sort of in West Omaha, it takes a long time to get bank debt, to get debt associated with something in a way that I would say in some communities doesn't always happen. That's tough. Second group is, I would say if you are looking to match your prototype grant or you're doing something on the front end where you don't have very much capital to put to work yourselves, that's hard to find. And that is hard to find here. What I would say to both of those is it's really hard to get somebody to take a capital bet when you don't have capital. That's not very helpful. I recognize that's not very helpful. But there are times where I have been frustrated because you're in a conversation where somebody's like, well, they should just give me $25,000 because I'll clearly do a good job. And the pushback I would have is like, what evidence do you have that you would do a good job? And so if you haven't been able to save money, if you eat, like, and people are like, there are really poor, destitute people that I get it. Like it's harder for people. I grew up upper middle class. Like I understand the difference. But if you haven't been able to document it, like sometimes putting your shoes on, putting on the other person's shoes who's going to loan you the money or give you an investment
is challenging. So I think on both sides of that, we need to come up with better instruments that allow us to do this. So I really like the Pebble Grant program that Donna Harris runs. I think the 100 in Grand Rapids is a rock star program, which is they do $1,000 grants to 100 people. They do 10,000 to 20 people, and they do 100,000 to one. And it's grants along the way. That path is awesome. It's unlocked a ton of people that wouldn't normally have said, hey, I want to try this. So, I mean, I don't want to give you the impression there are none, but Omaha has not been proactive at doing that. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a failure of vision, maybe. I think it's a really important thing that we must do, but I don't know necessarily that either of those programs are exactly right for Omaha.
So then connecting with entrepreneurs, connecting with VCs, ecosystem builders, what are some community spaces within Omaha that you'd recommend people can check out, whether that be co-working spaces? Are there any events that happen? What comes to your head with that?
It's funny that you asked that question, because what comes to mind is a conversation I've been having all summer with regards to Big Omaha and the need for a gathering event that is externally facing, where people from around the country come and sort of resonate with each other at sort of an authentic, real level. I don't think Omaha has that. And I think that vacuum is felt in a way that I would not have expected 10 years ago going. So I went to all 10 Big Omahas. And I think if you said, hey, after year 3, this is going to go away, I would have been like, okay. Not because I wanted it to. I thought it was really good, but I didn't appreciate how important it was. Like, one of the things I've learned that I would just emphasize is it is really important to have those galvanizing community events. And I would say Omaha is really hurting because we don't have that thing that we used to have. Now, 1 Million Cups is launching again with UNO here in 3 weeks, and Startup Grind, Craig's doing a great job. You know, I mean, like, I can give you events, but I think me listing events is not as important as saying, hey, this Big Omaha thing actually was our thing, and we did a terrible job letting it die.
That's sad. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think there's like those events you listed, is there a place to go learn about them, like a website?
1 Million Cups for sure has a website. I get stuff on LinkedIn for Startup Grind. I have never been to their website, but I'm sure I would guess there is one. I don't know.
Yeah.
What are some other places that I would go? I mean, so I think the University of Nebraska Omaha, Dale Easley, and the Center for, I think it's Innovation, Entrepreneurship, and Franchising has done a really good job of sort of saying, hey, we kind of need this, we need that. So I think if you went to their website, there'd be 3 or 4 kind of listings. Andrew Price-Dye has done a good job with Event Vesta working in Omaha.
Yeah.
But I think it's my job to plug Mug News right here. Like, we have an excellent event calendar, and you should totally go there.
Yeah, Event Vesta, check it out, everyone.
Yeah,
it's a really cool app. Yeah, definitely. Okay, we're just gonna plug it. I'll do it. But their app is really cool, so you should totally check it out.
Yeah. Who would you say is the most successful startup from Eastern Nebraska, I would call it?
I mean, most successful startup ever?
Yeah.
Or current, or one that people would identify right now?
I'm interested in the ever.
So there have been something like $27 billion enterprises created in Eastern Nebraska. If you look back, you can kind of look at the ages at which they were created. So, like, it's hard for me not to say First National Bank of Nebraska wasn't an awesome startup in 1865, now that it's the largest privately held bank, or, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
So like, there's great legacy stories about entrepreneurs, like Kiewit Construction becoming the 2nd largest construction company in the world. But I think kind of in the last 20 or 30 years, the ones that people typically resonate with are, I think there's like Huddle, Builder Trend, Flywheel that people go back to. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, so to give you an idea, Millard Refrigeration is the largest exit we've had in the last 10 years. And I don't think anybody talks about them as a startup story, but they exited for more than $1 billion.
Whoa.
And so within that, I think this is the point. We don't tell stories. So you can have somebody like me who looks at these things historically, and you ask them a tough question, and I can list off 15 companies, some of which people are like, oh yeah, I've heard of that one. But very few of them could say like, oh yeah, this is the story of when they started. This is how they grew. This is, you know, when they exited, et cetera. You know, TD Ameritrade sold to Charles Schwab in 2019 for whatever billions of dollars. Tenaska is a $22 billion enterprise. And again, most of those things are just not talked about. Part of it is we don't talk about money, but part of it is it's like, what is the scoreboard? So like, in some ways, Tenaska is probably our most successful startup because they only have about 600, 700 people and they're worth $22 billion. Whereas like Berkshire Hathaway, which is twice as big, has 65,000 people. So if you're like, what's the net margin on people as your metric, then Tenaska looks pretty darn good.
Yeah.
But Tenaska also builds a lot of really big power plants, which are really expensive. Mm-hmm. So it just depends on how you define it. But I gave you a list of about 10.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I feel like I nailed it. I feel like I got that question. Or I totally didn't nail it by giving you 10 instead of 1.
Yeah.
No, going off that line then of, so you listed all those startups. What about some entrepreneurs that you've worked with? Some notable, successful?
So I can't speak towards like the most successful entrepreneurs that I've worked with. I can only tell you the ones that I've worked with that I was like, I really like that guy. He's got his act together. And I would say the person that I worked with that I consider a friend, so this is a little bit of a call out to one of my friends, is David Chait from Trafify. I think he's an amazing founder. Smart, dedicated, culture, team, like all the pieces that you would want, intentional, like just really good. So that would be one that I'm guessing most people wouldn't guess. I would be probably, a lot of what I've learned about entrepreneurship is in watching Bill Sheldon from Beehive Industries work. And so I still reference Bill all the time because he's so funny. He's both really funny, but also just like dry, such that he'll sit in a room for an hour and say nothing, and then everybody will leave and he'll say the funniest thing you've heard, and only one person got to hear it. But my favorite line from Bill was, so we've done all these customer interviews of all these government folks, and he says, God, feels like it's stone knives and bearskins out there. Talking about our customers, we're still using pencil and paper instead of software. And I think when you spend time with somebody like Bill or somebody like David, and I spent a lot of time with him when I was at Nebraska Global, you realize that like there's a ton of smart people and there's a ton of businesses that never are going to get recognized as the best, run by really great people who are trying to solve a really hard problem. And sometimes they don't quite get there, and sometimes they do. And sometimes they do, and it's only a $3 million business.
How do you think the Nebraska media market, you mentioned the storytelling component, who tells entrepreneurial stories very well? He's giving me a look.
I don't think anybody does. I mean, I think there are podcasters. Nick Kastner, for example, does a good job of going out and trying to identify these. I think JT does a pretty good job. I think there are people who are intending to do this. I think Silicon Prairie News is okay. I mean, I think it was better 10 years ago. I think Mug is okay. I think I work at Mug, so if you go out there, you can read my stuff. We do okay, but I mean, I don't think we do a great job of telling stories. I think we're still trying to figure out how to tell the story effectively. How do we tell David Chait's story and have people care enough to read it? Because I think many people, I should say, maybe not most, just gloss over it. I think it's really entrepreneurs who hear the story of other entrepreneurs and go, yeah, that's right. And I don't think we get that right now. I don't think we've quite hit an entrepreneur and be like, yeah, that's exactly how I'm feeling. Mm-hmm. And so I think we need to do a better job. But I think we as Nebraskans, so before this, I looked at, I think Rivals, maybe Nebraska Rivals, Husker Online. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
And it's like, they're talking about like Gabe Irvin, the somewhere between first string and third string running back, and talking about like plays in his high school state championship game. My point of that is to say, like, if you just take Husker football storytelling and the depth at which we get to know these 18 to 22-year-olds, and you overlay that onto some of our best founders, you'd be like, wait, I don't, like case in point, go read Crunchbase and look at Huddle. They're tied to the HUD, Housing and Urban Development, Twitter account. That's what Crunchbase has done. I mean, my point of this is like when I say we don't have stories, I mean, we're reporting on the wrong thing. Like we literally have 0 stories at times. But I think Matt Olberding and the Journal Star does okay. I think the World Herald is okay. I mean, they don't cover it very often, but when they do, I think they're pretty good at writing. I mean, I think they do a good job of articulating a story. I just think they don't spend much time on it. I don't think it sells newspapers. So it does come down to the community a little bit to be better on social, on other platforms like Mug, to be able to get out there and tell our stories more effectively. And I'm not, there are better storytellers than me. So how's that for an answer? I walked through.
Good answer. Yeah.
35 things.
Thank you for the shout out on the podcasting, and JT Martin with the Nebraska Made podcast. I do think he does a very good job at production.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, their show is well produced. Caitlin.
I guess I just had one more question was, we spoke about diversity, equity, inclusion. How is it that you're supporting diversity within your ecosystem?
It's a really good question. It's a hard question because I think the right answer is like, oh, I do all these things, blah, blah, blah. But again, I don't want to be the guy that talks about form and not substance. And so I'm going to give an example of where I failed. Mm-hmm. So about 2 years ago, we had the Maverick Venture Fund class and every single person was a male. And I pulled Levi Cermak, and I was just like, this is unacceptable. We cannot have this happen. So there's already a predisposition in venture capital, in finance, toward men, period. Like full stop, whether it's funding, whether it's who the principals are, et cetera. That's a failure of imagination because he was like, well, I put out the stuff and this is just who showed up. So I'm not calling out Levi. What I'm saying is the intention starts now. So like this morning on a call with Levi, I said, we are going to start literally the first week of school to make sure our next Maverick Venture Fund class has more women in it. Does that mean it will happen? I don't know. But I didn't say that 2 years ago. And I did say that today. I think a lot of what I would say I've improved on when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion is being willing early in processes to say, are we accounting for it? Doesn't mean we get it right. It just means I'm at least more intentional. I don't think that's very good, by the way. Like, I don't think that's up to the par I expect of myself, but I do think that that's a thing. Like, that's improvement, if you will. It's like I went from a D and now I'm a C minus. The other thing I would say about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's a little it's not your question, but I think it's an important part of this is I spend a lot of time in metrics. We have terrible metrics for DEI. Like, we don't collect them. So, one of our clients is the Nebraska Tech Collaborative, and I got off a call today with Jana, who's the executive director, Jana Van Doon. We were talking about DEI, and we were basically like, we haven't made any progress. We can't show that we've made no progress because there's no way to measure it. Like, I can't go in and say like, oh, this is the number of African-American technologists who entered the field in the last 2 years. Like, the data does not exist unless people report it. And what I would say the struggle that I have just in my work is people are now starting to ask the question, how are you going to measure this? And the data's terrible. So if you said 10 years from now, you've been wildly successful at DEI, I would say that while I hope I've continued my personal journey, I would say the thing that I have the biggest impact on is calling for more DEI data to be recorded through Census Bureau, BLS, et cetera, so that we can really see the disparities of women technologists, women founders. And that doesn't even begin to get down through LGBTQIA. It doesn't, like, there's some stuff that, like, I'm not even sure how you do it, but like, clearly when it comes to men and women, we should do a better job. Clearly when it comes to race and demographics, we should do a better job. Clearly when it comes to age. Some of the other stuff, I'm like, I'm not sure how to do that. We can do better, but I'm not even to the point where I know how to do that. A lot of that other stuff is just doing it. Like, we've decided, we've made a commitment, and we're going to do it.
Nice. Well, I think that's a very, very good topic to end on. Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and we should have you back on sometime.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
I enjoyed myself.
Perfect. Good. And Caitlin, it was also wonderful making content with you in person.
Oh my gosh, it's been absolutely fantastic. Also, the whole just vibe of also all of us being in the same room, like, it is so cool to be able to honestly make eye contact with everyone.
Yes.
I swear to goodness. Like, and not have a glitch in the computer.
Yeah. Well, when you come back from Atlanta, you should stop again. So.
Yes, happily. I will happily come back. It's been very nice to work at mug.news HQ and get to co-work with everybody. So that has been an absolute blessing. I'm so glad that I'm here. And
We're glad to have you.
Yeah, well, we should do another rendezvous again soon.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Nick, do you want to read us out?
Yes, yeah, thank you. I almost forgot that portion. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Ecosystem Builder podcast, which is a product of mug.news and hosted by myself, Nick Kastner, and my wonderful co-host, Caitlin Clays. If you have any questions about today's episode, connect with us on Twitter at Nick Kastner, at Clays Creates, or at Mug News Official. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review and share with your friends. It helps support the show. Legit, please do it. We release episodes every single Wednesday morning, so make sure to tap that follow button so you don't miss out.